Actually, they're competing for prey with the snappers, but maybe it's because of intraspecific competition because the pinfish were more abundant there. So they may be having some negative effects within species. And again, we don't know. We didn't investigate this. Those are just some potential explanations. But no obvious big differences. I mean, there's no reason for us to be alarmed by this. I want to go on now and talk about parrotfish. And the parrotfish we're talking about is Nichols-Sina. These are specimens that we collected from the northern Gulf. The one on the left is a terminal phase male. That's what we assume. That's as big as we ever collected. The other ones are different sized juveniles. And again, these species spend their whole life in seagrass beds. There's not much known about them. They occur from Venezuela all the way up here to where we are. They're not that common in the tropics. They're around, but most people don't study them. They study the pretty ones that live on coral reefs, not the drab ones that live in the grass beds. So we know something about their feeding habits, but that's pretty much it. So we did a little work on them ourselves and tried to look at feeding preferences. When we did stomach analyses, virtually all their stomachs were full of seagrass. And it turns out that most of their stomach contents were thalassia or turtle grass. We offered them 3 different species of seagrasses, the haliduli, the thalassia, that's turtle grass, and syringodium or manatee grass, and you can see they didn't prefer turtle grass. They ate significantly less when offered other choices. However, when we find them in the field, we only find turtle grass in their stomach, and that's really where you capture them. So our conclusion about that was it's the best hiding place, and that's why they're there. Certainly not the preferred food. We did some other work where we looked at food consumption rates in the laboratory under controlled conditions. And what we found was that these Nichols-Sina consume turtle grass at a rate of about 0.27 grams per individual per day. And we have a paper coming out here real soon in MEPS that sort of talks about how these data were gathered. If you look at the median net primary production of turtle grass in the northern Gulf of Mexico, it's on the order of 1.4 grams dry weight per meter squared per day. Now, to make the math simple, if we were to assume that there was a density of 1 parrotfish per meter squared, not unreasonable density, pinfish are several individuals per meter squared, for example, then you could do the math and find that around 19% of the daily primary production of turtle grass would be consumed by these fishes if they were present at 1 individual per meter squared. Again, this is not a trivial amount, so that's a fairly significant thing just from these small fishes. And they're like most herbivores. They're eating all the time. It's what they do. So I want to move on and talk a bit about manatees now and green turtles and their potential interactions in the seagrass habitat. So manatees really were not commonly observed in the northern Gulf of Mexico. The first paper I can find was this one done in 2005 that sort of talked about historical observations of manatees in the northern Gulf, going from Mississippi to northwest Florida. And the reason this paper was published was because manatees had started to be observed in the early 2000s in that area. So these people summarized what was known about them in our area. And this is the kind of habitat that we see them in now in Mobile Bay. They're common all the way from the top of the bay down to the bay systems, the bottom of the bay system in the higher salinity areas. Our water is relatively turbid, so it's not so easy to see them. But people really love them. And the one over here on the far right is eating grass off of somebody's lawn. And people, they really think it's cool to have them come up, and because they're kind of rare. I mean, South Florida, they're everywhere, but up there, they're pretty rare. I think we estimated this summer we had about 30 manatees in Mobile Bay, so it's not huge numbers. But here's the data. We have a manatee sighting network now at the Sea Lab, and you can see that from 2007 there have been about 1,400 sightings of manatees. You see all the dots where they have been sighted. And some of the work that's going on there is to look at habitat associations, where these manatees are coming from. Virtually all of the manatees we have in Mobile Bay winter in Crystal River. They come all the way back to Mobile Bay, spend 6 or 7 months there, and then come back to Crystal River. And we just had a couple of them die last week when it got really cold. They were still in Mobile Bay. They didn't make it back in time. And the manatee people do necropsies, and I can tell you, we built a separate building for them when they bring those dead manatees in. Now, here is the sighting record over time from 1980 up the recent past, and you can see the numbers have gone up a lot. And partly that's because people are looking for them now, but they're looking for them because they're more abundant. So there clearly is a little bit of bias in there, but they're definitely more abundant than they used to be. So I've got a little video of manatee feeding here. Let's hope it works. Is it working? Yeah. You can see they're kind of sloppy feeders. So in addition to all the consumption that's taking place, there's a lot of leaves of seagrass that are being released as they sort of let them slip out of their mouth there. So their consumption is pretty significant, and it's greater than the actual amount that they ingest. So let me see, I'm not sure why that's like that, but we can see what we need to see up there. The estimate is that adult manatees eat on the order of 35 to 50 kilograms of wet weight of plant material per day. So think about that. I mean, that's really a lot. These guys are eating all the time. They're big, and they're really feeding a lot. Okay. All right. So I wanted to move on to this next slide, which was taken from a paper published in PLOS One a couple years ago. And it was by some people looking at the evolutionary history of sea cows, the whole sea cow family, which manatees fall in, and dugongs that are present in the Indo-Pacific. At some time in the past, these dugongs were really, and manatees were really quite common. You can see some of the study sites where they've excavated fossils. Some of these individuals were huge. They were the size of elephants. Others had tusks on them that they assumed was used to dig up the roots and rhizomes of the seagrasses. But if you can see kind of in the middle of the picture, this is what they assumed seagrass beds looked like when these individuals were common. And we found a slide of this on the internet. My students found this, and it looks like a mowed lawn. So somewhere in the 1950s, somebody got this same idea, and you can see them here. Might have been at Weeki Wachee Springs or somewhere. I don't know. I want to now talk a bit about green turtles. And green turtles have been becoming more common in the northern Gulf of Mexico. And I think people first realized this in 2002. About this time of the year, there was a cold stunting event in St. Joe Bay. And at that time, there were on the order of over 4,000 juvenile turtles that were cold stunned in the northern Gulf of Mexico. And in St. Joe Bay, over 2,000 of them were juvenile green turtles. So this is a huge number, and I don't think anybody had an idea that there were that many juvenile turtles in this area. And there's a paper published that looked at some of the green turtles that didn't make it. Most of them did survive. The turtle lovers got out there and put blankets around them and warmed them up and everything, and most of them survived. The ones that didn't were brought to the lab, and stomach contents and all kinds of information that you can gather from these specimens were taken. But this paper just sort of tells you how many of these turtles were present during this cold stunning event. And I guess when the water temperature gets below about 50 degrees, they sort of become listless and just float to the surface. And that's what happened then. And it's probably happening right now, because the water temperature, I looked this morning, was 46 degrees up there. So here are some of the turtles that they rescued. They're at the St. Joe Preserve. And you can see they brought them in, and I think all of those made it. They went out, released them in the Gulf of Mexico. They immediately came right back around and went back into St. Joe Bay, where they had been. Now, this same thing happened recently in Big Lagoon. Big Lagoon is in Perdido Bay. It's the bay system that separates Florida and Alabama, and it happened last winter. There was a cold stunning event there. Green turtles were realized. And these are all juveniles. You know, as they become adults, they move further south, but this would be from dinner plate size up to about this size green turtle. So we don't know how many were there. I don't think they really did a good estimate of that, but you know, some of the green turtles did show up, and I would imagine, again, that this is happening right now. Here is a map that shows you nesting habitats of green turtles. The darker colors indicate more nesting activity, and you can see over here the bulk of this occurs on southeast Florida. But the lighter greens show you other areas where nesting is taking place. And I just wanted to show you that green turtle nesting is occurring up there in the northern Gulf, all the way past Pensacola, and that's right next to Dauphin, or Mobile Bay is right on the outside of that. So we're starting to see nesting take place up there as well. Now, a paper was published in 2010 by Jim Forker and a number of other seagrass people, and they had been called to Bermuda to look at a case of seagrass decline. Turtle grass was declining in the coastal waters of the Bermuda Islands there, and so people were concerned. They figured there was some kind of disease. So they brought in the seagrass experts. And what they did, as they got in the water, they realized there were a lot of turtles around. And so the light bulb sort of turned on. They said, well, perhaps the reduction in seagrass has something to do with grazing by turtles. So they did a bunch of exclusion cages and came to the conclusion that most of the change in seagrass biomass there was due to grazing by turtles. The turtle abundance had increased for unknown reasons, but the counts of the turtles had certainly gone up in Bermuda. People had known that, and it looks like they were having significant effect on the seagrass. And I'll show you a picture of that in just a minute. The same thing was noticed in the Indian Ocean. There was a marine reserve that was set up in the Indian Ocean. Green turtle abundance started coming up dramatically because hunting had been stopped on them. When this happened, seagrass biomass began to decline. The wider leaf species were replaced by narrow leaf species, more weedy type species. And the fishermen were really unhappy about this because their catch had gone down. And what the conclusion was, the shelter provided by the broadleaf seagrasses had really been reduced so much that there wasn't enough shelter for the juveniles to survive to big enough size for the fishermen to catch them. So this has been published too. And here's a slide from the work in Bermuda. And you can see the ungrazed versus the grazed area. So it's pretty dramatic and pretty big difference. And again, just kind of showing you what some of these grazers can do. And I wanted to remind you, there are a number of plots here that came from a paper published back in 2002. And the plot shows you seagrass biomass across the bottom there. We've got 3 different sets of plots on the number of species, the biomass, and the number of individuals from 2 locations in seagrass habitat, in Buzzards Bay, Massachusetts, and Chesapeake Bay. And the point here is that there's a positive relationship between submerged vegetation biomass and fish species number, biomass, and abundance. So, it's something that we have recognized for a long period of time. Less seagrass equals fewer fish. So this is the kind of thing that I'm thinking about is likely to take place in the Northern Gulf. And we do have this paper that's in press that gives a lot more detail about some of the things I've talked about. I kind of skirted right over these, but there is more information available on how we did some of these things. So I wanted to finish up here with a couple of other points and talk about mangroves. Another species that's moving into the Northern Gulf. These are black mangroves. And historically, black mangroves had not really been found in our area. And you can see these dark green areas kind of show you the historical range of the black mangrove along the western and eastern Gulf and on the east coast of Florida. And what we're seeing is that mangroves are now being found in these areas of lighter green, all the way up to the top of the Gulf of Mexico. So we've been working on mangroves in a couple of different areas. Let's see, this area is the Chandeleur Islands that I mentioned, where we had done the seagrass trawling. Chandeleurs are probably about half black mangrove now and about half Spartina marsh, and so they've really moved in a big way there. We've also found some black mangrove here on Ship Island and Horn Island. And just for reference, here's Dauphin Island, where our lab is over there. So we've been doing some work on these mangroves, and the picture on the bottom shows you what it looks like in Chandeleur Islands. The one on the right shows you Horn Island, where mangroves have just colonized. So what we've done is start a study to look at what potential changes might occur as the black mangroves move in and displace the Spartina. So we're comparing areas with black mangrove, areas that have mixtures of black mangrove and Spartina, and then pure stands of Spartina. So I have a master's student named Whitney Scheffel who's doing this work, and she's had a little note come out in Gulf of Mexico Science on this. So what we're doing is looking at the potential nursery role of this black mangrove habitat compared to that of Spartina. And these habitats are well known to support high densities of juvenile finfish and shellfish. So the question is, if the mangroves come in, is this going to be the same? Is it going to be better, not as good? We're also looking at food web shifts, looking at changes in detrital decomposition rates, microalgal production, nutrient dynamics, and Juice Sebrian at our lab is doing a lot of this work. So we're trying to sort of say, let's start at time 0 and see what kinds of changes take place as the mangroves move in. And for comparison, we're doing work in the Chandeleur Islands. That's sort of our space for time substitution. The mangroves down there have been coming on strong for at least a decade, so they're further along down the trajectory. So we're doing similar kinds of studies there in the Chandeleurs and going to compare what we see there with what we see at these newly established areas. And you can see there's only 5 or 6 trees that are growing there now, and I'm sure that they're taking it hard right now too with this cold weather. Okay, one other thing I wanted to mention, we haven't done a lot of work on corals, but just anecdotally, I used to take a marine ecology class to St. Andrews Bay in Panama City, and we would snorkel on the jetties, and I would have them look at zonation patterns. And there used to be on the order of a handful of small coral colonies. The last time I was there a year or two ago, there were several hundred coral colonies there. So, I mean, just anecdotally, I'm thinking something's going on there too. And I don't know if people are looking at that in the Northern Gulf or not. Maybe somebody here could be, but I think there's something worth checking into. Here, I've just got a slide that was taken from a paper published a few years ago. And this is from the Flower Garden Reef. So these are pretty far north, 27.5 degrees north. And a cropper palmata was found there in the Flower Garden Reefs at a depth of some 23.5 meters. This is pretty unusual. Those of you that know corals know that a cropper typically occurs in shallow water, wave-battered areas. And here it's being found at a depth that's deeper than anybody ever known it to occur before. And not only that, this is a long way away from any coral, so most people didn't think that a cropper had potential for long-distance dispersal. It's shown up here on these Flower Garden Reefs, which are kind of off the coast of Texas. So that's kind of unusual, and whether there's something different about this is some kind of different kind of growth pattern or growth strategy, who knows, but there's something else that's happening here. I wanted to mention something that we just started doing, and that's looking at tiger shrimp. This is kind of, along the lines of non-indigenous species, really climate change and rain shifts, but tiger shrimp are moving into the Gulf of Mexico. And I don't know if any of you have had the opportunity to see these shrimps, but they're massive. They're really impressive. They're native to the Indo-Pacific. They were brought to the U.S. as an aquaculture species in South Carolina. They got loose during a storm. They've eventually made their way all around the tip of Florida and into the Gulf of Mexico. So we've got a study going on. Jennifer Hill is a postdoc who's been working with me, and Sea Grant is funding this stuff. They're interested in potential impacts with the native shrimp species. And that size of them is real. I mean, they're the size of a lobster. It's quite impressive. So we're doing a number of things. We're looking at habitat preferences. By then we're looking at potential competitive interactions with the native species, whether they prey upon the native species or not. So that stuff has just started this year. One thing that is kind of interesting, we know we feed them little blue crabs and they eat them. So these are really carnivores. They're different than most of the Penaeid shrimps that we're used to seeing that are this size. I mean, these guys are pretty carnivorous. So I don't know, we may wind up with a harvest of these tiger shrimp instead of the native species, but they certainly eat them in the Indo-Pacific, and there's nothing wrong with a big shrimp like that. So just a few concluding remarks here. The shifts of the tropical species into the northern Gulf are increasing. It's not unidirectional. There's kind of steps up and down, but the trend is clearly going on. We don't really know for certain what effects these tropical fish species are going to have on the natives. Right now, we don't see any evidence that there's any big interactions that ought to be concerning us, but I think the jury's still out a little bit on that. I do think that the shift from detrital to grazing food webs and seagrass beds is likely as these herbivores come on, and I do think the stature of the seagrass meadows is going to decline. It will provide less nursery habitat, and I kind of think that's the way historically it had been. I think our ideas about seagrasses as being great nursery habitats is something that's only happened recently when most of the grazers have been removed. And the salt marsh nursery functions may shift. We're not certain about that as the black mangroves move in. And clearly that's a transitional thing. If it continues to warm, red mangroves are going to come in and colonize the seaward edge, and we'll have zonation like you see here in South Florida. So the black mangrove is just going to be something that we see for a while if it moves in and displaces Spartina. That's what's occurred in South Louisiana and some of the locations. Spartina pretty much gets out-competed. The mechanism, I think, is not totally clear, but black mangroves come in and Spartina disappears. So, that could be interesting to watch too. Clearly, we're early in studying this. There are probably lots of surprises. We certainly haven't figured it all out. So the usual, acknowledgments of the funding sources, they're important. And I want to thank Joel Fodry and Dottie Byron. Dottie's my lab manager. Joel was a postdoc here and really did a lot of this work as we got started with it. And then finally, I wanted to show you this last slide to see if you recognize any of your students here. This was one of your PhD students in her formative years when she was working in our lab in 2010. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
I think we have time for questions. Ready to do it?
So I have a question about your initial point that you were making when you're comparing the data that you currently collected on abundance of species versus the past data. Do you have any data in the same area from the past data, or are you just...
You mean, have we been over there sampling again?
Yeah.
I have not, but I bet Chris has been sampling in that area.
Yeah, I mean, those species are not uncommon over there. But you mean in Appalachian Bay further east?
Yeah.
Where the Livingston...
So you're comparing, so you're saying that, the abundances that now are greater than what you observed in a different location
Right.
30, 40 years ago,
Right.
give or take.
Right.
How, what could potentially change those abundances? Or, how can you compare those two? They're not in the same location. Does that make sense?
Well, yeah, I mean, they're clearly not in the same location. They're the same habitat. They're seagrass habitats. We use the same sampling gear, the exact same sampling gear, mesh size and all those kinds of things, trawling speed and so on. And if anything, I would have expected a bias toward more tropical species in the Livingston sites, just because they're a little further south. They're in really stable salinities. We've got fluctuating salinities, and so if anything, I would say if there was a bias, it would be toward finding more tropical species in the Livingston data set if they were there. And I'm pretty sure they weren't. They just weren't there. So I thought you were saying if we went back now, would we see a different assemblage of fishes that would include the tropical ones? And we haven't done that, but I'll let Chris speak about it if you want to. You don't have to, but.
Well, I mean, we have seen those same species that you're seeing further west in Appalachian Bay, but I haven't made the comparison with the Livingston data to see if that's changed.
Yeah.
Have the habitats changed? Because 40 years, that's a lot of things can happen.
Just a moment. What are you talking about? So,
especially with SABs, you have various different parameters that go into how they survive their habitats in general, sediment,
Yeah.
sort of.
Yeah, I would say those habitats are in as good a shape as any seagrass habitat in the state of Florida. I don't think they've changed much because there are not many people there.
Okay.
For that same reason. And I see Paul Carlson in the back. He does seagrass surveys for the state of Florida. I hope you agree with me on that. If you don't say anything then.
June of 2012 was really hard on big bank seagrasses, and we saw catastrophic losses of those. So that may complicate your comparisons. And while I've got the floor, let me ask you a question. Do you see cold kills of the emerald parrotfish?
We haven't seen that. I wouldn't doubt that it occurs. I mean, we've not noticed any, but that doesn't mean it hasn't happened. The only thing I can say is we've seen terminal phase adults, so I know that they've survived, they've overwintered for at least a couple of years. Yeah.
I had sort of an overwintering